Hi everyone, and welcome to Sustainable Edge, a podcast produced by Position Green. I'm Joachim Nahum, Executive Chairman at Position Green, and your host for this podcast. In this episode, I speak to Simon Mundy about his book, The Race for Tomorrow, where he travels to 26 countries, meeting the people on the front lines of the climate crisis, showing how the struggle to respond is already reshaping the modern world and propelling a groundbreaking wave of cutting-edge innovation. I also speak to Simon about why the ESG bubble burst, including the exodus of corporates and investors from net zero alliances, and why this may be a good thing. Finally, we touch on why Simon is optimistic about businesses and capital working together to find sustainable solutions, and why the US cannot afford to let China win the sustainability race. Welcome back to Sustainable Edge. I'm very excited to have with me today Simon Mundy from the Financial Times, where he's an editor of Moral Money. And Simon is also the author of Race for Tomorrow, Survival, Innovation and Profit on the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. Simon, great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to delve into your book, which I personally highly recommend. It is a book that takes you to the front lines, as it's called, on climate change in terms of its impact on communities, on countries, on people, poor, rich, across the globe. You traveled to more than 26 countries during a period of about 2 years, and that is the basis for your book. Tell us a little bit about how did you come about this project, this sort of traveling and visiting all these places. What inspired or motivated you to do this? Tell us a little bit how you came about doing it.
I was not always focused on climate change in my work. I spent the first part of my career as a foreign correspondent based in South Africa, South Korea, and in India. And it was while I was in India that I got really, really interested and focused on this subject. It was a story I did that I think sparked my interest. It was on a very severe drought in Western India. And I took the train out to this area called Marathwada, where farmers had been getting pummeled by very severe drought that was destroying their livelihoods for many of them. I walked across fields that were completely devastated. I walked along the floor of a reservoir that was completely empty of any drop of moisture. The suicide rate for these farmers in this area had been going through the roof. And it was a very, very shocking and tragic story, which really opened my eyes to the immediacy and urgency of climate change. I think very often then and even now, people often talk about climate change in terms of the future, the world that we leave for our grandchildren, what the world will be like in 2050 or 2100. But right now, there are many, many people around the world whose lives are already being devastated in very serious ways by the impacts of climate change. And then, of course, there is the opportunity side. The fact that as the world, albeit belatedly and imperfectly, wakes up and responds to the climate crisis, this is one of the world's all-time great economic opportunities. If you look at the contest for supremacy in clean energy and all the other sorts of investments that are being made as we move towards a low-carbon, more sustainable world economy. So I just thought this is the biggest story for my generation of journalists, and I want to get out there and tell it. And I wanted to tell it not just relying on internet research and Zoom calls. I wanted to do it the old-fashioned way, get my shoes dirty, get on the ground, meet the people who are involved in this, and a real variety of perspectives. Because I think that with climate change, a lot of people find it quite difficult to engage with. The subject is so huge. Where do you even begin? There's so much science to engage with. There's so much political, often very heated political rhetoric around it. So I wanted to write a book that would not be, here's Simon's opinion. It would rather be meeting people with a variety of their own really important and powerful perspectives, sharing those perspectives. So I set out on this journey, as you said, 2 years, 26 countries, meeting people from mammoth tusk hunters in Siberia to Prince Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, to clean tech tycoons in Silicon Valley and Guangzhou, to people from the Philippines to Nicaragua who are feeling the worst effects of climate change. And together, what I hoped to put together was a real window into this story that would give anyone a starting point for really getting to understand this situation, this incredible story, but also for people who are already knowledgeable about this, a new window, a new perspective on some of the most important angles on the story.
I think, breaking it down into 26 stories of what is the climate challenge and the opportunity, who are the people, it becomes more relatable. And one of the countries or I should say territories you visited, which has been a lot in the headlines recently, is Greenland. And with Greenland, the backdrop from a climate perspective, obviously, is that the ice is thawing. It is affecting the livelihoods of people living in Greenland. But there's also opportunity. One of them being passages with the ice melting, that ships can now move through Greenland from Europe to Asia, for example, transporting goods and services, and creating economic opportunities. So it's an example of where there is a lot of concern, but also opportunity in terms of the climate change. And obviously the political backdrop with a place like Greenland being interesting from a geopolitical perspective, but also, as we mentioned, climate change creating economic opportunities. Do you want to just say a little bit more about this sort of Greenland example as risk and opportunity when it comes to climate?
Yeah, absolutely. And Greenland, as with most of the countries that I went to, when I got to the country, started looking into the stories, and I found that there were multiple stories interlocking that I had to find a way to put together. And so in Greenland, again, there were several different narrative strands that you'll find combined in that chapter. I want to start by paying tribute to Conrad Steffen, who was one of the all-time great scientists who have helped us to understand the challenge and threat that we face with climate change.
And who tragically passed away shortly after you interviewed him.
Exactly, and this is one of the most shocking things, probably the most shocking thing that happened from my perspective during the reporting of the book. And I think it's so important to remember the importance of the work that he did. So this is a scientist from Switzerland who every year for decades would spend weeks or months camped out on the Arctic ice sheet in Greenland, tracking what was happening to that enormous expanse of ice. And it's thanks to his work, more than perhaps any other scientist, that we know that ice sheet is shrinking and melting much more rapidly than had previously been thought possible, with potentially enormous effects for global sea level rise. And I met him in Greenland in a town called Ilulissat just before he was taking his helicopter to the ice sheet. And he was telling me that because of the accelerating melt and movement of the ice sheet, these crevasses were opening in the ice that were getting increasingly dangerous to navigate. And just 4 days after our interview, tragically, Conrad Steffen fell into one of those crevasses and his body was not found. And I just think it's so important for us to pay attention to what these scientists are telling us. What a miracle it is that as we're faced with this threat from climate change, which is a very, very serious one, we have thousands and thousands of people, incredibly well qualified and expert in their fields, working for us to shed light on the problem, to give us this unbelievably sophisticated analysis of what's going on and what we can do about it. And I just think it's knuckleheaded the way that some people take pride in not reading the science and saying, "Oh no, well I'm skeptical about this stuff." It's a pre-Enlightenment perspective.
Just on that point quickly, one of the things that caught my attention in the book was the climate scientists have come with new predictions and dire warnings of what is happening on climate change. But he points out that they're actually quite conservative. So to be able to sort of have a consensus among countries and the climate scientists, they're actually quite conservative in their estimates in terms of global heating and the impact it's having. So he's saying it is actually far more challenging, and there's a lot more happening there than they can actually necessarily write. They're erring really on the side of caution. They're being very conservative with their reports. And yet the reports do not exactly read as conservative. It's gone from yellow to red. So I think that sort of conservatism here, in the same way that they're not being actually alarmist from that perspective, brings home the point you're making about that this is very reliable science, and if anything, it is too conservative in terms of what's actually happening and what the world will look like.
Absolutely. It's such an important point, and one that I was very careful I wanted to get across in the book. Now, Greenland is, as well as being an incredibly powerful case study in terms of climate science and the seriousness of the situation that we face, there were two other strands there, which are also strands running through the book to some extent. One is the way in which climate change and the response to it is feeding into the global battle for geostrategic power. So as we're seeing now, again, as he returns to office, Donald Trump wants to buy Greenland, and this is something which, as I wrote in the book, he tried to do also in his first term. The second time round, people are taking it more seriously. The first time round, people just thought it was a silly joke, but it's not actually. There are good strategic reasons to take Greenland and the Arctic very seriously. The ice is melting at an extraordinary rate, which means that these sea lanes are becoming increasingly navigable. Now, for Greenland, it's an uncomfortable position, but there's also an opportunity to potentially play these big powers off against each other. And for the relatively small population there, which is small enough to fit inside a decent-sized football stadium, for them to get quite wealthy from the increasing feasibility of extracting the minerals in Greenland.
Which is happening because the ice is thawing and they're more accessible.
They're more accessible, exactly. It's not so much to do with the retreat of the land ice. That's only having a marginal increase. It's the melting of the sea ice, which means that you can get much better access to these mineral resources. So that could have benefits. But the third angle in Greenland, which again is something which is running through so many chapters in the book, is the extent to which communities are having their lifestyles and livelihoods and community cohesion really disrupted by the impacts of climate change. So I went up to the far north of Greenland towards the end of my stay there, to a place called Qaanaaq, which is at least not allowing for really tiny little scatterings of houses. It's the northernmost town in the world. It's got a few hundred people living. It's about 800 miles south of the North Pole. And people have been there since roughly the 12th century. They crossed over the ice from Canada with their dog sleds, and they've been there ever since. This is an ancient and incredibly special way of life. They go out on the ice with their dogs hunting, and this is the way that they have lived for years. And the techniques and the wisdom, the know-how was passed down through the generations, from one generation to the next, over centuries. But now they're finding that this know-how is often no longer valid because the behavior of the ice is changing, the seasons are changing, the ice season is getting shorter and shorter, the ice is getting more and more dangerous. And it seemed to me, from my conversations with the ice hunters, that they seemed unsure of how many more generations this way of life would be possible for. And this is something that I saw echoed in different ways, from Ethiopia to the Solomon Islands to Bangladesh to Mongolia. These very precious and unique ways of life are threatened in many, many cases by the impacts of climate change.
Another thing I wanted us to touch on, Simon, was your book really reports from communities and countries that are perhaps, if not underreported, they're certainly not in the limelight of global media, especially when it comes to climate change. Now, we've recently had an example that was in the limelight and that has caught everyone's attention, the wildfires in LA, in California, and the devastation there even on a global comparison, was tremendous. And there's a community, obviously, there that has been impacted terribly, losing their homes, some people also losing their lives. But on the whole, are we getting the full picture of what's happening to communities around the world? Even though there isn't an LA example every week, there is every day a community that is impacted where property, people, and livelihoods are disappearing due to climate change. Are we getting the full picture?
Absolutely not. A lot of the places that I went to for my reporting, I was the only foreign journalist who'd ever been there. And this is inevitable. I mean, we live in an age where journalism is, by many measures, less well funded. We all know that many newspapers have been closing, or they've been reducing their coverage networks. Fewer and fewer people are paying for news. More and more people are relying on social media. So inevitably, this means that there's a shortage of deep global reporting. So this is something which, in some small way, I suppose, I was trying to address with my research for this book. I think we are clearly getting a very stark and vivid and shocking picture of what's happening to Los Angeles. And it's really valuable that so many journalists have been doing a great job of bringing that footage and that information to us. But if this was happening in a much poorer country, clearly we would be getting little, if any, coverage of that sort. So it's important to remember that the vast majority of people in the world live in developing countries, and developing countries are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, largely because they tend to be more distributed in the tropical regions that are more affected by many of the worst climate impacts, often because they're less prosperous, they're less well protected against some of these impacts. But there is this incredible distance between those of us who are living in London or Oslo or New York and those who are living in small villages or larger settlements in developing countries. And there's that distance, that psychological distance coupled with obviously physical difference, that is making global coordination very difficult, as I've seen at the recent COP conferences, where there are real disagreements between the rich countries and the developing countries over how we tackle this.
And one of the sticking points obviously being whether the West should pay or compensate the developing world for these climate changes as a incentive to avoid further industrialization or global warming, and that obviously being the sort of main disagreement at the last COP.
Absolutely. So I think something which I don't claim to have all the right answers for how global efforts should be organized in response to climate change. But I would just urge everyone, and this is one of the key messages of the book, it's not the only one, but it's one of them, which is the incredible urgency of the situation for many people in developing countries especially. And not only in developing countries, as we know, Los Angeles and Valencia, the people there can attest to how immediate the threat is for many people in developed countries too. This is not a long-term future issue. This is something which is hitting many, many people around the world right here and now.
Yep. Let's move on to the business aspect of this. In your book, you describe also individuals and companies who are or have made money or hope to make money from climate change. That is, there are lots of opportunities when it comes to technology and understanding how climate will impact the business side of things. Yet, when you're writing this book, you were sort of in an age, or at least a period of climate optimism, I would say, when it came to business. There was a lot of capital coming into projects around climate technology. There were entrepreneurs and others who saw this as a great opportunity, and there was generally a lot more optimism around it. Now, if we fast forward 3-4 years later into 2025, the headlines around climate and business tend to be a little bit more negative.
At the same time, you mentioned how from a climate reporting perspective, there's this great distance, but from a business perspective, that distance may be less in terms of supply chains and the impact and the exposure. And you take the Los Angeles wildfires, there's probably not an insurer in the world who's not somehow exposed to that in terms of risk. So what happened when you were writing you've described it as peak ESG. Where are we today?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to distinguish between green noise and green action and green investment. So the peak ESG thing, as you mentioned, this is when I was in Boston in the summer of 2022, and I saw a poster of Gisele Bündchen, the supermodel, who was being promoted as the ESG advisor for FTX, the famous cryptocurrency exchange.
Now infamous.
Clearly infamous and no longer existent. And I just put a post on social media saying peak ESG ? And in hindsight, I think I can say I called that one right. And that was just the epitome of green posturing. It was bullshit.
Yeah.
Can I say bullshit?
You can say bullshit.
Okay, great. It was bullshit. And there was quite a lot of that at one point. And this was something that actually quite shocked me when I found myself at COP26 in Glasgow. And that was the first COP that I'd been to, the first UN climate conference. And I just found there were a lot of people there who were treating this as a marketing opportunity, a lot of people from big corporates who probably had good intentions, but were not really taking seriously how tough this was going to be, how disruptive a net zero transition was going to be. You had companies just throwing out targets without serious thought, relying heavily on low quality carbon credits that had not been subject to proper scrutiny. And I was very uneasy about that because I think there were some people who were saying, well, anything that sounds green, any ambitious sounding green pledge must be good. And I was thinking, well, hold on, if this stuff is not rigorous, then it's not going to be good. Now, what we've seen since then is a complete implosion of the bullshit. So these companies that were coming out with these insubstantial climate plans, companies that were treating this as a marketing opportunity, they've gone into hard reverse. They're reversing at 100 miles an hour for two reasons. One, because they've been subject to scrutiny over greenwashing. But secondly, and more important in many cases, is the pushback that's come from US Republicans in particular. Now, something that's important there, and this is not necessarily to do with bullshit, but it's to do with alliances, commitments, and collaboration. So we saw a lot of financial companies coming together into sectoral alliances and committing themselves to hard targets where they would be monitored and assessed by other parties, either UN affiliated bodies or other groups. And this was something where various politicians and lawyers raised concerns about fiduciary duty, about antitrust, about collusion. Now, we can debate whether or not those concerns are actually valid, but they were taken seriously enough by a lot of these companies to think, okay, we need to reduce the extent to which we are committed to things that we don't have control over, where we're committed to targets that have been drawn up by some other third party. That's not the same thing as companies retreating from green stuff altogether. I think they're doing it in a more intelligent way. And if you look at the actual hard numbers around money and investment, last year, according to the International Energy Agency, $2 trillion was invested in low carbon energy. That number has been going up and up and up. So
and 2024 marked the year that Texas as a state produced more green energy than dirty energy.
Absolutely. In some of the heartlands of the conventional fossil fuel energy industry, we're seeing an extraordinary boom in low carbon energy. The way I see it, what we're living through is, and I think this is absolutely no exaggeration to say this is one of the great transitions in the history of human civilization. we went through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and then in the 1700s, the fossil fuel age began. And that has been the most explosive period of human history. If you look at world population, you look at advances in technology, you look at pretty much any metric you care to name. The fossil fuel age has been transformational. We've now realized fossil fuels are cooking the planet, and we're going to have to move as quickly as possible into the post-fossil fuel age. And luckily for us, we have alternative technologies that are available and in many cases actually cheaper than fossil fuels. So this is one of the biggest things that's happened in the history of human civilization. There's absolutely no exaggeration to say that. Of course it's not going to be easy and smooth. Of course it's not going to go smoothly across a linear trajectory. There are going to be ups and downs. And I'm pretty sure that when we moved from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, there were a lot of people with big incumbent interests in the bronze industry who pushed back against it. And we're seeing a similar thing now. It's not going to be smooth, but the long-term direction of travel is very clear.
So you're describing this more as an inevitable disruption, and not all of the disruption is a bad thing. It's first of all exposing greenwashing or what were half-baked commitments to begin with. You're pointing out that there is still capital there, and the capital is leading to innovation and technology and alternatives that are good for climate change or mitigation and adaptation of climate change. At the same time, are we not moving into sort of a period of where there is an appreciation of climate risk, as you pointed out, and if it hurts your assets, and from a fiduciary responsibility, you have to say if you have exposure to climate risk, but nobody's really taking responsibility in, okay, what do I commit to? Where do I put my money as an investor or as a company? What should be expected from me in the green transition? And this also comes back to regulation in terms of what is reasonable to ask or demand from businesses and investors to ensure that we have a sustainable transition. And here there's a big disagreement between the US and Europe. Europe has moved in quite surprisingly, many would say, how hard they have actually regulated the sustainability space in terms of a corporate mandating disclosures on emissions, transition plans, while the US, obviously, at least under Trump, is not very likely to go down that route. So where do we sort of end up in terms of the responsibility side of businesses, not just the sort of climate risk and more opportunistic here, but some sense of commitment or responsibility that is obviously realistic and not something that happens in 2050 or is just reduced to whether CEOs wear the Sustainable Development Goals on their lapels. What is sort of reasonable to ask as action from businesses and investors?
Well, of course, it depends very much on what sort of business you're in, as might seem obvious. But I think one of the things that really, really struck me from doing my research in the book and subsequent reporting is the scale at which this investment is happening and the ingenuity of some of the innovations that are being developed, often by startup companies. So,
can you give us an example?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if I just zoom in on the chapters in the book on China and the US. So in China, I went to Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. In the US, I was in Silicon Valley and also at some projects in Texas and Georgia. Now, the scale that is being developed by Chinese companies is extraordinary. I went to the BYD campus in Shenzhen, now by far the biggest EV maker in China.
And the only one who can really compete with Tesla globally.
They're going head to head with Tesla. They're pretty much neck and neck in terms of pure EV production now. And the scale of their campus in Shenzhen is amazing. There are 40,000 people just living on the campus. Their campus is a decent sized town in and of itself. And when I was speaking to people at BYD and at other companies, including XPeng, the electric car maker, Envision Energy, a big integrated green energy company, a company called Unison, which is focused on solar, the speed with which they're moving and the extent to which these companies, when I was speaking to their CEOs, they seemed to feel like this was the best opportunity for them to get rich by hitching their wagon to the horse of Chinese government strategic vision. So it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping's government wants to really build upon the supremacy that it currently has in many areas of the clean energy industry. And if you're someone like He Xiaopeng, the head of Xiaopeng Motors, he was previously in software, but he was like, no, this is where the big bucks are to be made. And in the US, it's a different sort of landscape where there's perhaps not the same type of scale in many cases as you see in China, but the US, having the world's most advanced and sophisticated and well-funded university system, has managed to build this unbelievable ecosystem of really, really advanced startups built upon incredible technical expertise, backed by this venture capital ecosystem that is able to deploy serious amounts of money fast. And some of the companies that I was encountering there were doing such interesting stuff at the real cutting edge of science. So to name just one of them, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, we talk about how, money into sustainable investing has been under pressure. Commonwealth Fusion Systems has raised over $2 billion to develop what they claim will be the world's first working fusion power plant. And this is something which I've now spent a bit of time with the CEO of that company. I'm not a nuclear physicist. I'm not qualified to judge whether or not in the next 2 years he will, as he claims, manage to get this thing. He's persuaded investors to put $2 billion into this. And if he does, if they do manage to unlock the potential of fusion power, it's an absolute game changer. So I would say to those in business who are wondering how to approach this, I would say don't underestimate the speed and scale of what's happening there, which in many cases will mean that it's much more economically rational for you to pursue the more sustainable option.
And we spoke about also that US-Chinese rivalry may not be a bad thing when it comes to this, meaning that if the US wants to catch up or stay on par with China, they will need to continue schemes such as the IRA, essentially incentives for businesses to invest in technology and green infrastructure, and that it's not just semiconductors and defense, it's also sustainability, innovation, and technology when it comes to competing with China. So as long as China is doing what you describe at scale, the US may be forced to do this. And Trump, despite some of the rhetoric coming out of there, will have a strategic interest to continue US programs such as the Anti-Inflation Reduction Act, where US businesses get a tax rebate or other good reasons to create technology, but also green jobs, which are, by the way, also more prevalent in red states so far. So this may be a good thing, US-Chinese rivalry when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important thing to bear in mind. I don't claim to understand Donald Trump. If anyone does, please let me know. I'd be fascinated to hear about it. But what I can say is that it would be incredibly self-defeating if his ambition is to make America more economically competitive, which I think it is. I think that's at least one of his objectives. It would be unbelievably stupid to remove all government support for clean energy. Because, as I said, this is clearly the direction of travel for world energy systems. And there's a risk for the US that they will end up being weak in many of the key industries around this if they don't think strategically around building their own industries in this space. So obviously, Joe Biden presented this with a double logic. On the one hand, he said this is about jobs and economic competitiveness. He said it's also about the planet. Now, Trump doesn't seem to care about the planet, but the first of those pillars of the logic behind it, the economic competitiveness, that is absolutely stronger than ever. So I'd be pretty surprised if Trump were to pull all this strategic support from the government. I think you'll see certain areas where it will get pulled. I think, for example, subsidies for electric vehicles, you might well see that being pulled. It's worth noting that that would be a competitive advantage for Elon Musk's Tesla if it does get pulled, because unlike some of the competitors...
Good for Tesla, bad for Rivian and others who are trying to catch up.
Exactly. Tesla is already profitable on a unit economics basis, so it doesn't need the help of those subsidies in the same way that the competition does. But I think in terms of trying to build that ecosystem of plants making batteries and solar cells and panels, I think it would be astonishingly stupid for the US to just turn its back on that, and I'd be very surprised if that happens.
There's a compelling business case, which at the end of the day, if he's a businessman, which he says he is, it will convince him to continue essentially with a lot of the similar policies that Biden has been putting in place. Great. I think we've covered some really great aspects of your book, of the business case. One thing I'm taking from all of this, Simon, is that you are perhaps cautiously optimistic, or quietly, if not, that you're more optimistic than pessimistic when it comes to this, and that what you refer to as the green noise. If we actually take away the green noise, we're left with at least some pretty good, compelling business cases for why we should continue investing in green technology, the resilience of communities and countries when it comes to economic competitiveness, and maybe also when it comes to innovation of communities somehow dealing with this. Obviously, there are some, I would say, sad or less optimistic backdrops here if you're looking at some of the local communities, but there are also examples of communities thriving and finding new ways to make a living, for example, in Greenland. So on the face of it, or on the whole, are you more optimistic than pessimistic?
So I think my work on this space for the book and for the FT has made me more optimistic and more pessimistic, in the sense that I'm certainly more keenly aware than I was before I started focusing on this field of how bad things are getting for some people, for many people around the world. As I mentioned, we might not realize it always when we're in our comfortable homes in rich world cities, but there are many people who are getting pummeled by this already. So it's opened my eyes to that, but it's also opened my eyes to the amazing amount of ingenuity that is being deployed by people in such a wide range of fields all over the world, and the enormous financial firepower, $2 trillion last year, the enormous financial firepower that's now being put behind it. I think sometimes people, when they talk about climate change and climate action, I think people risk seeing it in quite binary terms. So there was this sense of, in 2021, a lot of people were thinking, okay, we're on the right track and everything's going to be all right. And then more recently, I get the impression from some people that people are thinking, no, we're on the wrong track and we're all doomed. The answer is somewhere in between. It's not binary. It's a spectrum of outcomes. From good to bad, we're going to land somewhere in between. Now, the good news is that over the last 20 years, actually, if you look at the trajectory of where we're headed to if we continue on the current track, it's not good, but it's better than it was, actually. That trajectory of expected future warming based on business as usual has been coming down a bit. We need to get it down much further. But the point is that this is a struggle. And I understand if some people are getting discouraged and down at heart. But the point is that in any sort of struggle, when it gets tough and you have setbacks, you have to try even harder. And I think that's what a lot of people are realizing. And I think there is an enormous opportunity for anyone involved in this field, whatever walk of life you're in, whether you're in finance, whether you're in business, whether you're in the media like me. Each of us has an opportunity in our different way to contribute to that better outcome that we hopefully all want to see and do something we can be proud of.
I think that was a great way to end our conversation, on an optimistic note, and doubling down on whatever you're doing out there as a listener, whether you work directly with sustainability or indirectly in finance, media, or any other type of profession. I think you've given us some great pointers of optimism and taking away some of the green noise. And again, I would recommend everyone to check out Simon's book, The Race for Tomorrow, which gives a lot more context and in-depth information on some of the cases we discussed here. And there are even some great photos along here to visualize this. And thank you so much for joining us here at Sustainable Edge, Simon.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.